We are currently facing our first ever global energy crisis, and like basically everything that has happened these past 2 years, it can be linked back to the pandemic. The lockdown cut down our energy consumption dramatically, which in turn dropped the energy costs. But as the pandemic came to an end and demand increased, prices increased in part due to a lack of supply, along with certain energy-intensive events involving a certain member of OPEC. Not to mention that this member of OPEC also produces a large supply of natural gas. Here in the US, prices of natural gas have tripled since October of 2020, and in Europe they've increased by a factor of 10. This has then prompted many nations, the US included, to rely more on coal for electricity production. An increased demand for coal obviously drives up the prices, so along with natural gas and oil, other fossil fuel types are the most expensive they have been in years. Now, while Europe is probably being hit the hardest due to its historic reliance on certain countries for oil and natural gas, America is certainly not unaffected by this energy crisis. But if it weren't for some racist laws from the early 1900s and a major focus on cars being the main mode of transport, then we could be far less affected by the prices today and be reliably energy independent. Hello people of the internet, I'm Nico, a 21-year-old who spends way too much time inside researching video topics, and this is how we could have avoided the worst of the looming energy crisis if it weren't for the historically racist R1 zoning. Here in the US, we love oil. The memes about us perking up from hearing the word oil didn't come from nowhere, and the oil consumption figures back that up. Take a look at the top consumers of oil around the world. We've got our peaceful snowman building neighbors up north, we have my home of Germany, this country that has gotten enough news recently, Japan, India, China, and then the US right at the top. But why is it that we use so much oil and other fossil fuels? Well, let's break it down. According to the IEA, a group of people that get the absolute fizz from tracking energy, most of our oil consumption is from transportation, with the rest split between industry and a little bit to residential, commercial, and producing electricity. All in all, we use nearly 20 million barrels of oil per day, with almost half of those being imported. Now, some of that massive consumption we cannot avoid because the government burns a lot of fossil fuels on our behalf. Obviously, for keeping the massive and absolutely crucial military functioning, there's going to be a lot of energy used in the form of gasoline, jet fuel, electricity production, and so on. Then of course there's the police force and all the firefighters we rely on in emergencies who also need fossil fuels to protect us. That being said, there are ways to bring down their energy consumption, but I'll get to that later in the video. Of course, oil is not the only fossil fuel we use. Here in the US, a lot of the electricity we produce comes from natural gas and coal, with a slowly increasing amount coming from nuclear and renewable energy forms. But since renewables account for less than 20% of our total energy production, and renewables aren't the cause of the energy crisis, the best way to bring down energy costs is to decrease our energy demand, and the International Energy Administration has several good recommendations for how we can bring down our energy consumption, and unfortunately they're not going to work that well here in the US. The IEA has a wonderful little picture illustrating all the best ways to decrease our energy consumption, including the use of public transportation, riding a bike, driving smarter, and doing various things around the house. Technically, all of these things do work, and in Europe this will be easier to apply, but here in the US it's going to be much harder to follow those recommendations, and here's why. Here in the US, we drive a lot, on average about 30 miles a day, covering over 14,000 miles a year. The interesting thing is that of the 4 daily trips every person on average takes, only 15% of those are commuting to work. The vast majority are for shopping or errands and recreational or leisure activities. And crazier still, here in the US, over 60% of trips taken by car are 6 miles or less. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the same distance the average Swiss person covers on foot every day. Now, this isn't new news. I've been hearing for years that Americans don't take nearly as many steps as Europeans, and there's a very simple explanation for this. America is unwaveringly car-centric. So while the IEA recommends we take public transportation or hop on a bike to run our errands or go to work, the truth is that for many people in America that is simply not possible. In my hometown of Tuscaloosa, a city of 100,000 people, there are 2 separate bike paths, both on the Riverwalk, and a grand total of 7 buses for the whole city. 1 bus per bus line. Compare that to the city of Winterthur, Switzerland, a city of 109,000 people. They will have 12 trains coming through their central station every 30 minutes, and they have an extensive bus network on top of that. And this is quite easy to see with a little game of Google Says What. Open up a new tab and Google USA Transportation. Go to Images and you will see, Traffic, and Amtrak. Don't they have a good reputation? Now, do the same thing again, but Google Europe transportation, and it is just trains galore. Clearly, in Europe, it is much easier to get around without needing a car, whereas here in the US, the idea of jumping on a bike or catching a bus or a train just does not work. And with that, driving smarter is the best bet. Something as simple as driving 5 miles an hour slower on the highway or not leaving your car idling in the parking lot can save you some good fuel and money. And if you can carpool, that would be even better. But what about the things you can do around the house? How does that help? Well, unfortunately, because of how most of our residential land is zoned, we're still not going to be able to cut down the consumption by much. Like many countries, we have many different types of residential zones, and we label them as R1, R2, and R3, with the number corresponding to the number of residential spaces allowed per lot of land. R1 is a single-family detached house, R2 expands that to duplexes, and R3 is anything above like triplexes or apartment buildings. The issue is that the vast majority of residential land in America is only R1 zoned, which means that everything is immensely spread out. That, combined with decades of underinvestment in public transit, means that everyone has to drive to get anywhere, which means that more fossil fuels are burnt. The other issue is that because single-family homes are by nature detached from all other buildings, they lack the insulation that attached buildings provide and therefore are incredibly inefficient to heat or cool. How inefficient, you may ask? Well, the amount of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions we produce to heat, cool, and power all households in the US is more than Germany as a whole produces. I hope that gives you some idea of just how much energy we use to power all these single-family detached homes. So what can we do? Well, there are some short-term things we can do and some long-term. In the short term, we can do everything the IEA recommends. We can try to use public transportation as much as we can, and if we have to drive, then we can go a little slower and carpool whenever possible. We can also swap out our light bulbs for more energy efficient ones, and we can also try and heat a little less this winter. Seriously, if you keep the temperature at 65 instead of 75 and just throw on a hoodie and sweatpants, you'll be perfectly fine. Now, in the slightly longer term, you could, depending on your finances, have solar panels installed or double-pane windows, though there are cheaper ways of, like, adding sealant around the doors. And to stir some controversy, you could also consider an electric vehicle, but that of course very heavily depends on your financial situation and if that even works for you logically, which won't be the case for everyone. In the long term, to avoid the worst of any future energy crisis, we need to remove R1 zoning so that developers are allowed to build more dense housing, and also redo our infrastructure to prioritize walkability and public transit. Once we do those two things, we will see a drastic decrease in our energy consumption. Just look at the energy usage per capita in Europe versus America. If you want to know how America became so car dependent and also want to know some good reasons to change that, as it has to do with those racist laws that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, then consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Comment below what you think would work best for tackling the energy crisis, and comment below how you've been affected by it. Until next time, people of the internet, peace out.